The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Callaway Medical Partners smelled the way all important rooms smell, of recycled air, expensive coffee, and the particular anxiety of people who cannot afford to be wrong. 12 chairs lined the long mahogany table. 11 of them held people with graduate degrees framed on their office walls, business cards with titles that ran 3 lines, and the quiet certainty that came from never once having been asked to explain themselves to someone they considered beneath them. The 12th chair at the far end nearest the window was empty. It was 8:59 in the morning. At 9 o'clock exactly, the door opened. The man who entered was not what anyone in that room expected. He wore a gray jacket that had been washed enough times to lose its original shape. His shoes were clean but unremarkable, the kind sold in the workwear section of a department store rather than any boutique on Michigan Avenue. He carried no briefcase, no portfolio, no tablet. He carried a paper cup of coffee from the cart in the lobby downstairs, the kind that cost $2 and left a ring on whatever surface you set it on. He was perhaps 58 years old, perhaps 60. His hair had gone mostly silver, worn short and without any particular attention. There was a small scar along his left jawline that had been there long enough to have faded to the color of the surrounding skin. His hands, when he pulled out the chair and sat down, were the hands of a man who had done physical work at some point in his life. Not recently, but not so long ago that the memory had left them entirely. His name was Harold Keane. No one in that room knew what that name meant yet. That would come later, Doctor. Renata Voss sat at the head of the table. She was 51, the chief of diagnostic medicine at Callaway, and she had spent 23 years building the kind of reputation that made other people quiet when she walked into a room. She had published 47 peer-reviewed papers. She had trained residents who now ran departments at institutions, whose names appeared on television. She wore her authority the way some people wear fine jewelry, not to show it off, but because she had simply stopped noticing it was there. She looked at Harold Keane the way she looked at most things she had not yet categorized. The meeting was a consultation. Callaway had been brought in as a secondary opinion on a case that had confounded 3 hospital systems over 18 months. A 44-year-old patient, male, presenting with a progressive neurological decline that did not match any recognized diagnostic pattern. The primary team had arrived at a working diagnosis 6 weeks ago. Callaway had been asked to confirm it. The confirmation was, in all but official terms, a formality. Harold had been hired to fix the ventilation system on the 39th floor. He had wandered up to 42 because the service elevator had stopped there and he had needed to use a restroom and had taken a wrong turn. He had been sitting in the chair near the window for approximately 4 minutes before anyone noticed him, and by the time Dr. Voss's assistant, a young man named Patrick, moved to ask him to leave, the meeting had already begun and Dr. Voss had already started speaking, and the interruption would have required more attention than it was worth. So Harold sat. He held his coffee with both hands. He listened. Doctor. Voss pulled up the patient's file on the screen at the front of the room. Case number, age, symptom onset. 18 months of imaging, blood work, lumbar punctures, metabolic panels. 3 teams, 4 neurologists, 2 specialists in rare disease. The working diagnosis was a variant of a prion disorder. Rare, progressive, currently considered fatal, within a median of 14 months from confirmed diagnosis. The room received this information with the gravity appropriate to it. Several people wrote notes. One woman, Dr. Patricia, head of neurology and the one who had arrived at the diagnosis, clasped her hands on the table and nodded at specific intervals the way people do when they want to indicate that what is being said aligns with what they already believe. Harold looked at the imaging on the screen. He set his coffee down on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Dr. Voss was midway through the summary of the proposed treatment protocol, which was, in the absence of any curative option, largely palliative, when the man at the end of the table spoke. He did not raise his hand. He did not clear his throat. He simply said in a voice that was quiet enough that the person next to him had to stop writing in order to hear, "The lesion distribution doesn't fit." Dr. Voss stopped. The room did not go immediately silent. It went through a brief intermediate state, a few people continuing to write, one person still turning a page, before it understood that something had interrupted the expected sequence of events, and then it went silent all at once in the way rooms do, when they cannot yet decide whether to be amused or concerned. Dr. Voss looked at the far end of the table. She looked at the gray jacket, the paper cup, the hands. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was not unkind exactly. It was the voice of someone accustomed to managing interruptions without breaking stride. "And you are," Harold told her his name. She waited for more, a title, an institution, something to locate him in the architecture of the room. He offered nothing further. "Mr. Keane." She said it the way you say a name when you're not sure what to do with it yet. "This is a closed consultation. I'm not certain how you came to be here, but the lesions are asymmetric," Harold said. "In a prion disorder this advanced, you'd expect bilateral involvement with a fairly consistent distribution. What's on the screen is predominantly left posterior, and the progression timeline is wrong. 18 months without the cortical involvement you'd expect at this stage." The room had gone a different kind of quiet now. Dr. Patricia set down her pen. Several people looked at the screen. Several people looked at Harold. One person looked at Dr. Voss, which was perhaps the most revealing thing that happened in those first few seconds, because it meant that person was already uncertain and was looking for instruction rather than forming an opinion of their own. Dr. Voss's expression did not change. This was a skill she had refined over many years. The ability to receive unexpected information without letting her face do anything that could be read as confirmation that the information mattered. "The differential was thoroughly considered," she said. "I'm sure it was," Harold said. He was not being sarcastic. That was the thing about his voice. It had no performance in it. He was simply saying what he observed to be true. "But the MRI from month 14 looks more consistent with an autoimmune encephalitis, possibly anti-NMDA receptor. Possibly something in that family. The early imaging, if you look at the thalamic signal." The thalamic involvement was noted, Dr. Patricia said from across the table. She had found her voice again. It had some steel in it, but it was the steel of someone who is working harder than usual to sound certain. It was factored into the diagnosis. "How?" Harold asked. "Just that. One word." Dr. Patricia looked at him. "The thalamic signal in month 3 is inconsistent with prion pathology at that stage," Harold said. "It precedes the cortical changes rather than following them. In a prion disorder, you wouldn't see that sequence. But in autoimmune encephalitis, particularly in the anti-NMDA class, thalamic involvement early in the disease course is documented. It's not common, but it's documented." Someone across the table said very quietly, "He's not wrong about the sequence." No one looked at who had said it. Dr. Voss looked at the screen. Then she looked at Harold. "Mr. Keane," she said. And now her voice had changed in a way that was small but unmistakable, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. "What is your background?" Harold picked up his coffee. He looked at it for a moment. "I used to be a doctor," he said. The past tense landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. People heard it differently. Some heard failure. Some heard disgrace. Some heard something they could not immediately name but that made them sit slightly differently in their chairs. "Used to be," Dr. Voss repeated. "Neurology," Harold said. "Hopkins, then Mayo. I left practice about 12 years ago." No one spoke. "I left practice," Harold said again with no particular emphasis. "Not because I was asked to." He set the coffee back down. He looked at the imaging one more time. If the patient is still alive, he should be tested for autoimmune antibodies. The full panel, not just the standard screen. And he should probably be started on immunotherapy empirically while you wait for results. If I'm wrong, you've lost a few weeks. If I'm right, you've given him his life back." The silence after that was different from the silence that had preceded it. It had a different texture. It was the silence of people doing rapid private arithmetic. Dr. Voss turned to Patrick, who was standing near the door. "Get me the full antibody panel results," she said, "and pull the month 3 MRI up next to the month 14. Patrick left. No one spoke while they waited. Harold finished his coffee. He set the cup down. He looked out the window at the lake, which was very blue and very flat that morning, the kind of flat that meant weather coming later. Patrick returned. He put the images on the screen. The month 3 MRI was on the left. The month 14 was on the right. Dr. Voss stood and walked to the screen and stood in front of it for a long time. Dr. Patricia stood and joined her, then 2 others. Then, one by one, the rest of the room. They stood there looking at what Harold had described. The thalamic signal in month 3, the asymmetry, the sequence. Dr. Voss said nothing for a long time. Then she said, to no one in particular, "He's right about the sequence." Dr. Patricia sat back down. She picked up her pen. She set it down again without writing anything. Someone said, "We need to run the antibody panel." Someone else said, "We should have run it earlier." No one said who should have run it earlier. The observation floated over the table unattached to any name. Dr. Voss turned around. She looked at Harold, who had remained in his chair at the far end of the table, who had not moved or shifted or done anything that could be interpreted as claiming the room. "Dr. Keane," she said. She had made the correction without ceremony. The title restored not as a concession, but as a simple recalibration of fact. Harold acknowledged it with a slight tilt of his head. "Why did you leave practice?" she asked. It was not a professional question. It was the kind of question that crosses the line between them, and she knew it, and she asked it anyway, because something about the morning had shifted the coordinates of the room. Harold was quiet for a moment. "My son was sick," he said, "for a long time. He needed someone present in a way that a practicing physician, at the level I was practicing, couldn't be, not fully, not the way he needed." A pause. "He's 26 now. He's fine." The room received this with the particular respect that people show when something they did not expect turns out to be larger than what they were prepared for. "You could have come back," Dr. Patricia said. Her voice had lost some of its steel. What was underneath it was harder to name. "I did other things," Harold said. "I'm good with systems. Ventilation mostly. I understand how things move through spaces." A man near the middle of the table made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Dr. Voss looked at Harold for a long moment. "The patient in this case," she said. "He has a son, 7 years old." Harold said nothing. "I would like you to be present when we discuss revised differential with the primary team," she said, "if you're willing." Harold looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at the lake, still flat, still blue, still waiting for whatever weather was building to the west. "I have a system to finish on 39, he said. "After," Dr. Voss said. Harold considered this. "After," he agreed. The antibody panel came back 4 days later. Anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. Confirmed. The patient, whose name appeared in the file as Raymond Chu, 44, father of 1, had been transferred to immunotherapy. The response was not immediate. These things never are. But by the end of the 3rd week, there were signs. Small ones. The kind that do not announce themselves but that the people who have been watching very carefully learn to recognize. Dr. Voss called Harold's cell phone on a Thursday morning. He was in a parking garage on the west side, eating a sandwich he had bought from a cart, sitting on a toolbox he kept in the back of his truck. "He said his son's name this morning," she said. "First time in 8 months. Harold was quiet. "I thought you should know," she said. "Thank you," Harold said. There was a pause on the line. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Consulting. No requirement to hold a license. We can structure it through the research division. Your insight on complex cases, on the kind of cases where the pattern doesn't fit what we expect." Harold ate the last of his sandwich. "I appreciate that," he said. "But," she said, "I'm not sure I want to go back into that world," he said. "Not because of what it was, but because of what I am now. I'm good at what I do. I understand how things move through systems. I notice when the pattern's wrong." A pause. "I don't need a title for that, Doctor." Voss was quiet on her end. "You could have said nothing," she said. "In that room, you could have sat there and finished your coffee and left." "Yes," Harold said. "Why didn't you?" Harold looked out through the parking garage at the slice of street visible from where he was sitting. A woman pushing a stroller, a delivery truck idling, a boy on a bicycle wearing a helmet that was slightly too large for him, riding with the particular careful focus of someone who has not been riding very long. "Because a man has a 7-year-old son," Harold said. "And I knew what I was looking at." He said goodbye. He put his phone in his pocket. He finished the last of his coffee, stood up, and went back into the building to finish what he'd started on the 39th floor. The ventilation system at Callaway Medical Partners was certified fully operational 11 days later. Harold submitted his invoice, $2,400 for labor and parts, to the facilities department, where a woman named Grace processed it without looking up from her computer. She had processed hundreds of invoices that month and would process hundreds more, and would not remember any of them, including this one. Harold cashed the check at his bank on a Friday afternoon. He drove home in a 2009 Ford pickup with 140,000 miles on it, the kind of truck that people look through rather than at when they pass it on the street. He lived alone in a house in a quiet neighborhood on the north side. A small house kept neat with a garden in the back that he tended on weekends, and that in summer produced more tomatoes than one person could reasonably eat. On the kitchen table, when he got home that Friday, there was a letter. His son had sent it. Still handwritten, always handwritten, a habit from the years when he had been too sick to look at screens for very long and had developed the preference for paper and ink that had outlasted the necessity. The letter described the apartment he was decorating, a trip he was planning, a book he had been reading that he thought his father would like. At the bottom, as always, "I want to hear your voice." Harold read the letter twice. He folded it and set it on the counter. He put water on for tea. Outside, the evening was coming in from the east, the particular quality of late light that flattens shadows and turns ordinary things briefly luminous. The tomatoes in the garden caught it. The old fence caught it. The bird feeder he had put up in March, which had been visited exactly once by a bird he had not been able to identify, caught it. Harold stood at the kitchen window and watched the light change. He thought about Raymond Chu, who that morning had said his son's name. He thought about a 7-year-old boy who would grow up with his father. He thought about his own son, 26 years old, and planning a trip and reading a book and living in an apartment he was slowly making his own. He thought that there was a specific kind of knowledge that had nothing to do with what you had studied, or where you had trained, or what was written on a wall somewhere in a building you no longer worked in. It was the knowledge of what mattered. It was the knowledge of what you were looking at when other people had stopped looking. It was the knowledge that a pattern, when it was wrong, announced itself in a language that most people had forgotten to stay fluent in. Harold had not forgotten. He poured his tea. He sat down. He called his son. Knowledge, in the end, does not live in the buildings where it was acquired. It does not live in the titles or the offices or the framed acknowledgments on walls. It lives in the person who carries it quietly, without announcement, through parking garages and service elevators and rooms where no one expected to find it, and who, when the moment requires, simply says what they see.